Hello and welcome to the mini lecture on induction versus deduction. I made an entire separate mini lecture for just this one topic, even though it is mentioned elsewhere for two reasons. First, because this seems to be an area regarding which new students have many difficulties. Second, because the book doesn't help matters by calling inductive arguments valid. Traditionally, inductive arguments are called strong, not valid. They can and are, in some cases, identified as inductively valid, which means the same thing as strong. It is much better to use the entirely different term strong, however, to avoid confusion with deductive validity. This is because the word valid, just by itself, would be ambiguous, and so we need to give it a default meaning. Since it is traditional to only use the terms valid and invalid to refer to deductive arguments, and to use the terms strong and weak to refer to inductive arguments, any use of the word valid without the inductive modifier will be taken to refer to deduction. It is therefore better to use the terms strong and weak when referring to inductive arguments, since you need to keep the concepts separate in your mind anyway. This helps you avoid confusion. It is also a traditional way to teach the subject. As a result of the fact that this mini lecture is meant to drive some of the points home, you will receive some of this material twice. Normally I do not substantially repeat material, but repetition isn't unusual for a real-time live course, so I ask that you put up with it this once. This is an important concept with which some students have difficulty. First, of course, I don't want you to psych yourself out. Of course, just because some students have difficulty with this concept does not mean that you should sabotage yourself ahead of time by telling yourself that it is a complex concept or difficult to grasp. It's not. Instead, I believe that a few students have difficulty with this due to two factors. First, they are not used to thinking about arguments in this way. That is to say, breaking them down into premises and conclusions and examining what the arguer is saying about how the later may follow from the former. Second, because in colloquial speech students use the word valid in a very vague way. In day-to-day speech you would probably use the word valid to mean something is true. Other times you might use the word simply to mean something is reasonable. The way people use this word in day-to-day speech is so ambiguous as to be almost useless, and it is not the way logicians use the word. Deductive versus inductive arguments. To understand what deductive validity is, we must first understand what an arguer is trying to do with a deductive argument. In a deductive argument, the person making the argument is trying to convince the audience that the conclusion must follow as a matter of necessity from the premises. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. But aren't all arguments this way? You might think so, but no, they're not. When you think about it, most arguments are not that way. Instead, most arguments are what we call inductive. Inductive arguments make the case that the conclusion follows from the premises in terms of probability. If the premises are true, the conclusion is likely true. This probability might be likelihood, or it might be overwhelming probability. Take, for example, the induction that the weight of everything on the planet has never suddenly doubled before, and so it will not double tomorrow. Even though it is overwhelmingly likely to be true that the weight of every object on Earth will not double tomorrow, if we are basing this on our observations of the universe and drawing conclusions from past events, then this is not true by matter of logical necessity. If it is true as a contingent fact about the universe. By contingent fact, we mean something is true as a result of some facts about the universe, not simply true as a relationship of ideas. Since the universe might change, or since the same argument might be made in a universe with different rules, an inductive argument therefore can always be theoretically wrong. It is always possible, for example, that the future might not be like the past. It could be the case that we have a law of gravity wrong, that every 14.5 billion years or so, gravity doubles and we just didn't know that before. One would have to be crazy to believe this, of course. But if it is a logical possibility, then the argument is inductive. Inductive arguments rely on contingent facts, facts about the world that could conceivably be different without contradiction. Deductive arguments are a matter of form. A deductive argument might mention something that seems like a contingent fact about the world, such as by saying all men are mortal, or all swans are white. But when it does so, it takes these premises to be absolutely true as assumptions. If a deductive argument says that all swans are white, then we are assuming when testing for validity that if something is a swan, it must be white. We are not looking at the world to see if all swans actually are white. and in fact they are not. The conclusions of deductive arguments are the result of definitions, categories, and other relationships of ideas. Because of this, if a deductive argument is valid, then if the premises are true, the conclusion absolutely must be true as well. Also because of this, conclusions reached from valid deductive arguments contain no more information in the conclusion than there are in the premises. When a deductive argument is valid, it is true because the ideas relate to each other in such a way as to force the conclusion to be true if the premises are true. As long as the definitions and categories and terms are kept constant, then, just like math, a valid deductive argument is valid in any potential universe, regardless of the physical facts about that universe. But the conclusions of inductive arguments bring in assumptions beyond the premises. For example, in the case above, the argument assumes that the future will be like the past, and that our senses can be trusted to give us good information, and that we are really living in a universe with physical objects, and not just existing as thoughts in the mind of some greater mind, and so forth. For deductive arguments, remember that the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. The only way that this can be the case is that the conclusion is somehow contained within the premises themselves. This means that for deductive arguments, the conclusion can contain no more information than what is actually in the premises. We do not actually gain any new information from deductive arguments. This is not true for inductive arguments. With inductive arguments, we can get out more than we put in, but it comes at the cost that there's the possibility that we can be wrong even when our reasoning is flawless. Deductive validity. An argument is deductively valid when the argument is a deductive argument. That is to say, when the arguer is trying to say that the conclusion follows as a matter of necessity from the premises. Remember that this necessity is meant in the strong sense. If we are relying on our senses or drawing conclusions from past similar events, then that is induction, not deduction, no matter how strong that induction is. Additionally, deductive validity requires that if the premises were true, the conclusion absolutely must be true as well, and must be true as the result of the premises being true. Deductive validity is a matter of form. Such arguments often reason from categories or definitions, and they all deal with relationships of ideas. What this means is that if one argument of a particular form is valid, then all arguments of that particular form are valid. But what is validity itself? We have already seen the definition. It simply means this. Validity means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion absolutely must be true as well. Note, validity does not say that the premises are true. It only says that if they are true, then the conclusion must be true. Another way of putting this is that the premises of a deductive valid argument being true forces the conclusion to be true. So the conclusion therefore must be related to the premises in such a way that the premises being true results in the conclusion being true with certainty. So both of the following are deductively valid arguments. If an animal has feathers and warm blood, it is a bird. A hawk has feathers and warm blood. A hawk is a bird. If pigs fly, then unicorns are real. Pigs do fly, therefore unicorns are real. Both of these are valid arguments. They are both valid because in both cases, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. In the first case, the premises are true, so the conclusion really is true. Therefore, the argument is not only valid, it is also sound. A sound argument is a valid argument that also has true premises. In the second case, the premises are not true, so the argument is not sound. The conclusion therefore may or may not be true. It could be true by accident, but it is not in this case. But the argument is valid because if the premises were true, if it were the case that pigs fly, then unicorns must be real, and if it were the case that pigs did fly, then it would have to be the case that unicorns were real. It is just that these things are not the case. Therefore, the argument is valid, but not sound. Inductively strong arguments. First, use the term strong or weak for inductive arguments instead of valid or invalid. Also, we do not use the term sound for inductive arguments. We use the term cogent. I'll say more about this in a bit. The book uses the phrase inductively valid. You will not be wrong if you always remember to put inductively in front of valid, but if you forget, you will be. So it is better to use strong and weak. A general rule of good writing and reasoning is to never be vague when you can be precise. I suggest this so strongly that I suggest that you cross out all instances in the book where the word valid is used to describe inductive arguments, whether it is part of the definition of cogency or induction, or just part of the chapter, and replace it with the word strong. Strong arguments are similar to valid arguments, but they are not the same thing. They cannot be the same thing because induction and deduction are different. Deduction argues that the conclusion must follow from the premises as a matter of logical necessity. Inductive arguments argue that the conclusions likely follow from the premises as a matter of contingent fact. Therefore, an inductive argument is strong if and only if it is the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion is likely to be true. Just as with validity, this does not mean that the premises must be true. The stronger the argument, the more likely the conclusion is to be true from the premises. So deductive arguments are said to be valid or invalid, and inductive arguments are said to be strong or weak. Likewise, inductive arguments are not said to be sound or unsound. Instead, they are said to be cogent or not cogent. Cogency. A cogent argument is a strong inductive argument that also has justified or warranted premises. Note that unlike the case with soundness, the premises do not have to turn out to be true for cogency. Instead, they must be warranted. This means that they sit well given what we already have a good reason to believe, that is to say our background beliefs. They must be well supported. Additionally, we cannot ignore relevant information. So deductive arguments can be valid or invalid, and sound or unsound, and inductive arguments can be strong or weak, and cogent or not cogent. So cogency is to induction as soundness is to deduction. That is to say, in the same way that deductive arguments are valid, inductive arguments are strong. In the same way that deductive arguments are sound, inductive arguments are cogent. They are similar, but they are not the same, because induction goes beyond the premises to contingent facts, and thus the conclusions and even the premises can be wrong. Deduction is about form and the relationship between ideas, and so we can know with certainty that the conclusion of a valid argument is true if the premises are true. Note this example. All birds have feathers. Polly is a bird, therefore Polly has feathers. This is a deductive argument because it has to do with the relationship of ideas, and because whatever you plug in for birds, feathers, and Polly, that is to say any argument with the same form, would also result in a valid argument. We might know that birds have feathers through induction in the actual world, but this argument is simply assuming that this is true as a premise. It isn't arguing that it's true. The following are examples of inductive arguments. Example 1. If people keep using resources and polluting to a significant degree, then there will be fewer animal species alive on the planet 10 years from now than there are today. There is every reason to believe that people will continue to use resources and pollute to a significant degree. Therefore, there will be fewer species alive in 10 years than there are today. Example 2. If everybody found a pound of diamonds in their backyard, the value of diamonds would likely drop to a small fraction of what they are worth now. We should expect everybody to find a pound of diamonds in their backyard soon. Therefore, the value of diamonds will probably fall. It is important to understand that both of these are strong inductive arguments because in both cases, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is very likely to be true as well. In the first case, the premises are strongly justified or warranted. Note that they could turn out to be false. Maybe we completely stop using more resources and reverse our trends. But we are warranted believing that even if we slow down, we will not actually be reversing a substantial amount of damage before more species become extinct. So in the first case, the argument is strong and it is cogent. Note how these are not a deductive argument. The truth or falsity of the conclusion depends upon contingent facts about the world, not a pure relationship of ideas. Also note that unlike with deductive arguments, cogency does not require that the premises be true, only that they be warranted. The second argument is not cogent, however. In the second case, the premises are not warranted, or at least one of them isn't. There's no real reason to believe that everybody will find a pound of diamonds in their backyards. There's sufficient warrant to believe that if they did, the value of diamonds would drop, if everybody did find them. But in order for an argument to be cogent, enough of the premises on which the conclusion depends must be warranted for the conclusion to likely follow. Without any good reason to believe that people will find these diamonds, the conclusion is so exceedingly unlikely as to be laughable. But this is not the same thing as being logically impossible. Therefore, the argument is not cogent, but, and this is important, it is still a strong inductive argument because if the premises were true, then the conclusion would likely be true. This is analogous to the way that a deductive argument can be valid even if it is not sound. Note also that this is induction because the premises being true does not guarantee a true conclusion. You can tell this without even dreaming up a scenario because these are arguments that rely on our senses and past cases and not on categories and definitions. For this reason, almost all scientific arguments are inductive, not deductive. You can also tell by making up counter cases, such as humanity continuing to pollute but figuring out a way to clone extinct species of animal, or inventing new species in the lab. But the mere fact that the conclusion is not the result of definitions or categories or relationship of ideas is enough to tell you that it is induction. Okay, that was a lot of information, so it would be a good idea to summarize what we have covered. For your own sake, I highly suggest that you use the terms strong and weak instead of valid or invalid for inductive arguments. You should also use the terms cogent or not cogent for inductive arguments and sound or unsound for deductive ones. I suggest going so far as noting these changes in your book as you spot them, starting with the glossary. Additional key points. Deductive arguments are about form. They attempt to show that the conclusion follows as a matter of logical necessity from the premises. Inductive arguments try to show that the conclusion likely follows from the premises. These arguments rely on contingent facts about the world. Some of these are information gained through the senses, generalizations based on past experience, assumptions that the future will be like the past. Almost all scientific arguments are going to be inductive. Most arguments you typically come across are inductive, or at least involve sub-arguments that are inductive. Neither induction nor deduction is better than the other. Deduction leads to conclusions that contain no information that is not already in the premises. Induction allows us to reach additional conclusions about the world, but at the cost of fallibility. And that wraps it up for this presentation. It ran a bit longer than I expected, but I sincerely hope that it was helpful. Until next time.